Chapter 41, Little Bear. As I approached, I could hardly believe my eyes. A live little bear stood there, blankly beside the fence, hardly moving at all. I couldn't tell how many months old this little brown bear was, but its size resembled that of an adult teddy dog. Its fur was a mix of brown and black, unlike an adult brown bear, and it had a hint of light yellow. A soft ring of white fur surrounded its neck, making it look irresistibly fluffy. I was stunned. What was going on? Had Big Bear abandoned its child? Did it leave in a hurry, or did it plan to trade its cub for some salted fish? That seemed incredibly irresponsible. Unsure how to handle this little bear, I crouched down for a closer look. The little bear seemed anxious, clumsily backing away as it noticed me. In that moment, I realized its right hind leg was dangling weakly, seemingly unable to bear any weight. Suddenly, clarity washed over me. I stepped forward, gently grabbed its front paws, and lifted it up for examination. The little bear's right hind leg appeared to be broken. It hung limply while the other leg flailed about clumsily. Did Big Bear see me as a rescue station and expect me to help treat this little one? If that's the case, this brown bear is surprisingly clever. I gently touched the little bear's injured leg, and it let out a sound that resembled a mix of a whimper and a yelp. This was the first time I had ever heard a bear cub make a sound, and it was akin to a freshly weaned puppy, so incredibly adorable. Hearing its needy cries tugged at my heart, and suddenly, I was overwhelmed with sympathy. I cradled it in my arms as if it were my own injured child. No matter the animal, they are always too cute when they're young. This little one was far cuter than my Ewer and Kang. Its bright eyes sparkled with wisdom. It was destined to be something special as it grew up. Big Bear's cleverness had already proven that. Holding the wailing little bear, I glanced northward, but Big Bear's figure had long since vanished. What an unreliable brown bear mom, I thought to myself, then carried the little bear back to the cabin. The little one struggled vigorously, but to me, it seemed clumsy. It was even weaker than little Ewer. Its body felt soft, and as I held it, I took out a jar of honey. Dipping my finger into the jar, I brought it to the little bear's mouth. It sniffed, then immediately extended its tongue and began licking eagerly. I fed it several times, but the little guy still seemed unsatisfied. I usually ration my honey, but now it was all being devoured by this little bear I had found. What a heartache. After eating, the little bear calmed down, its face displaying an innocent expression. With its round eyes and chubby head, it was simply too adorable. I laid it on its back on the bed and retrieved a first aid kit to examine its leg. The injury wasn't severe, it might just be a fracture. I found 2 thin wooden sticks and bandaged the leg, thinking that with some time, it should heal. Surprisingly, the little bear remained still while I treated it, making me wonder if wild brown bear cubs were all this well behaved. Perhaps it had inherited its mother's silly nature. Once I had tended to the injury, another problem arose. What should I do with this little bear? Should I return it to its mother? But where would I find her? Even if I did, would she take the little bear back? Honestly, I wanted to tame it, but brown bears grow too quickly. They can reach hundreds of pounds in just a few months. What would I feed it? Rabbits can eat wild vegetables, parrots eat insects, but what do brown bears eat? Honey and salted fish wouldn't suffice. Damn Big Bear. Not only did it abandon its cub, but it also left me with a dilemma. After pondering for a long time, I made a decision. I would keep it. Who could resist such a small creature? There was no way it would survive more than 3 days if I just tossed it out. Having made up my mind, I quickly set to work creating a nest for it. Since little bears grow rapidly, I didn't plan to build a house for it inside the cabin. Instead, I used thin wooden sticks to construct a bear's nest resembling a large bird's nest, positioning it next to little Ewer's rabbit nest. I jokingly said to little Ewer, "Hey, you have a new neighbor now." I lined the nest with thick weeds and added 2 rabbit pelts. Once it was ready, I placed the little bear inside. However, it seemed dissatisfied, crawling out on 3 paws and exploring the cabin like a curious baby. It even climbed in front of little Ewer's nest, trying to peek inside, only to be kicked out by little Ewer, landing on its back. The little bear whimpered, making pitiful sounds as if it had suffered a great injustice, laying on the ground and crying. Seeing this scene made me chuckle, but I also felt a pang of sympathy. After all, its leg was still injured. I quickly scooped it into my arms to comfort it, and surprisingly, after a few attempts to soothe it, it stopped crying. It even flailed its limbs, eager to get down and continue playing. I spent the entire afternoon playing with it, and Kang curiously perched on my shoulder, watching it. The little bear occasionally made hilarious moves, and I found myself growing fonder of it. This fondness even surpassed my feelings for little Ewer and Kang. Though I felt a bit guilty, this little one was simply too endearing. That evening, I returned from the woods with nightshade berries and fresh bananas, preparing a bowl of sweet, honey fruit porridge for the little bear. It devoured the meal ravenously, displaying remarkable agility as it ate. I decided to give it a powerful name, General Qian Kun, with the nickname Kunkin. That night, Kunkin howled until late, much like a puppy just brought home. No matter how I tried to soothe it, it kept me, little Ewer, and Kang awake all night. It wasn't until the early hours of the morning that Kunkin finally fell asleep in my arms, utterly exhausted. Chapter 42, Full-Time Dad. December 23rd. This morning, I woke up to find Kunkin sleeping on the floor in front of my bed. This little guy sure knows how to cause a ruckus. He kept me awake until midnight last night before finally drifting off. I scooped him up from the floor and gently placed him back in the bear nest I had prepared for him. Kunkin was out cold, completely unresponsive, even softly snoring. Little Ewer and Kang were already awake, curiously observing Kunkin. Kang looked as though he hadn't fully woken up. His usually round eyes were only half open today. He probably hadn't rested well because of Kunkin's antics last night. The sight of the little bear felt dreamlike. I rubbed my eyes and slapped my face to confirm I wasn't imagining it. However, what happened next stunned me. When I opened the door, I was greeted by a fish, a fresh, recently deceased freshwater fish known as white lotus catfish. I immediately thought of Big Bear, as I noticed two tooth marks on the fish. Was this its way of bringing me a gift? This creature was surprisingly clever, almost human-like. I looked around, hoping to spot the plump figure of Big Bear, wishing it would take care of its own cub, but I couldn't find it. Instead, I noticed that two of the dried fish on the drying rack were missing. What was going on? Delivering a fresh fish while making off with two of my dried ones. Still, I had to admit this big catfish weighed more than the two dried ones combined, so it hadn't really taken advantage of me. I struggled to lift the hefty catfish, which weighed about 10 pounds. The head of this fish was substantial, and it's usually the most delicious part, often used for making fish head soup. Its head is also the star in spicy fish head dishes. I chopped off the head and opened the fish. The belly is the tenderest part, rich in fat, so I planned to make soup with the belly and the head. I sprinkled salt on the remaining parts and hung them back on the drying rack for Big Bear. After chopping the fish head in half and cutting the belly into small pieces, I placed them in a pot to cook. It would have been great to have some ginger, cooking wine, and scallions. There should be some seasoning plants on the island, but unfortunately, I hadn't found any yet, especially wild ginger, which is usually easy to spot in the wild. After about half an hour of simmering, the aroma of the catfish began to fill the air. I heard Kunkin waking up, making sounds like, ow woo, ow ah. This little guy must have been drawn in by the smell. What a little foodie. I ignored him and continued cooking for another 15 minutes. The fish soup turned a snowy white, fragrant and inviting. I sprinkled some salt into the pot, removed it from the heat, and used bamboo chopsticks to fish out some boneless meat, placing it in a bowl to cool slightly before tasting. It was delicious. The fish meat was soft and rich in flavor, though it had a slight earthy taste. Still, it was much better than sea fish soup. It would have been perfect with some tofu. After finishing my portion, Kunkin's share had also cooled down enough. I carried the bowl and opened the door, and Kunkin dashed out like a pig that hadn't eaten for a week. I quickly grabbed the scruff of his neck to pull him back. The little guy struggled in the air, as if saying, "Let me out. I want to steal some food." I closed the door and placed the bowl on the table, opened the honey jar, and mixed some into the fish soup before setting it in front of Kunkin. People often say, wolfing down food, but today I witnessed what it means to bear down food. Kunkin didn't even glance. He sniffed once and immediately knew where the food was, then began to eat like a madman. The fish meat and soup vanished in an instant. After all the time I spent preparing breakfast, he finished it in just 1 minute. I suspected he didn't even taste it, he was just shoveling it down. I guessed he wasn't full, so I picked out the remaining fish meat from the pot and brought the pot itself to him. The little guy devoured everything in a whirlwind. By the end, his upper body was completely inside the pot. After finishing, he realized he couldn't get out and made some grunting sounds from inside. I rolled my eyes in exasperation and pulled him out. He let out a long burp. This wasn't a bear, he was even more gluttonous than Zubaji from the TV shows. The plan to repair the road had been disrupted by this little guy's presence. I didn't feel comfortable leaving him in the cabin, he was too rowdy, and with his right hind leg still injured, I worried his cries might attract predators like leopards. It seemed I would have to be a full-time dad, for now, at least until his leg healed completely, I would need to stay by his side. I placed him on the ground, and he began to crawl around and play by himself. Though the little guy moved clumsily and slowly, he was full of curiosity, looking around here and there, especially interested in little Ewer, often crawling to her door to peek inside. Little Ewer would occasionally jump, and he would mimic her movements, but after being kicked yesterday, he no longer dared to approach. Thankfully, little Ewer was there to keep him company, otherwise, I would surely go crazy spending all day with him. I planned to make him a harness, similar to what you would use for a small dog. Using vines didn't seem appropriate, Kunkin would surely be uncomfortable wearing it. So, I ran to the hillside and took down a nylon rope from the snare trap, quickly hurrying back home. This really showed how much I cared for the little guy. Out of breath, I returned home to see Kunkin chasing after little Ewer. I felt relieved and began to dismantle the nylon rope, separating it into several strands. I then measured Kunkin's size and crafted a harness for him. The harness was divided into 2 parts, one side for leading him and the other side was a vest that would fit around him. I didn't plan to tie it around his neck, fearing it might choke him. Instead, I wove a vest that would distribute the pressure evenly across his chest and back, ensuring that even if I pulled on it, it wouldn't hurt him. I put the vest on Kunkin, and he lowered his head to sniff it. He found it uncomfortable, scratched at it with his paws, but when he couldn't get it off, he ignored it and continued playing with little Ewer. Chapter 43, Daily Affairs. December 30th. It's been a week since I fostered Kunkin, and this has been the most fulfilling, joyful week since I landed on this deserted island. My small cabin now houses 3 little companions, and with Big Bear occasionally dropping by to deliver fresh fish, and sneaking away with its dried fish, the quiet and lonely life I'd been living has gradually turned lively. A few days ago, I had quite a scare while feeding the rabbits in the rabbit hutch. I noticed there were only 4 left. I panicked, thinking some large predator had snatched the other 3. Upon closer inspection, I discovered a small hole in one corner of the hutch. It turned out the 3 wild rabbits had dug a tunnel and escaped on their own. I was furious, and a little heartbroken. Ungrateful little creatures. I've been feeding them, cleaning their droppings, caring for them like royalty, and still, they wanted to run away. But after some thought, I couldn't entirely blame them. After all, I'd taken away their freedom to roam the grassy fields. It made sense that they'd try to escape, unless I could completely domesticate them, get them used to this cushy life of having food and shelter at the ready. So, I spent an entire day reinforcing the hutch. I buried large stones half a meter underground, encircled the perimeter with yellow mud and rocks. Now, let's see how they managed to break free. My little companions have been showing some interesting changes lately. Little Ewer has grown slightly, though the changes are minimal. Kang, however, has blossomed, its feathers have become more vibrant, and it's looking like a graceful little lady bird. I'm pretty sure it's female. The biggest thrill is that after my patient coaching, Kang finally spoke its first word, Kang. Its voice is a bit raspy, but hearing another person speak for the first time on this island, even if it's just a bird, brought tears to my eyes. Next, I'll try teaching it to say, Ewer. I pointed to little Ewer, repeating, Ewer. Who knows if Kang will understand. But the biggest transformation, of course, is in Kunkin. In just a week, he's grown noticeably larger and stronger, starting to show signs of a kingly aura. With his growth, his appetite has doubled. The freshwater fish that Big Bear brings barely lasts him a day, and the honey is almost gone. Though Kunkin is starting to look more bear-like, his personality hasn't changed. He's still that clumsy, adorable creature. He follows little Ewer everywhere, seemingly infatuated with her. After spending some time together, Kunkin and I have grown much closer, and even little Ewer has gotten used to his presence. Sometimes, when Kunkin snuggles up to her, she no longer kicks him away like she did at first. The two little animals are becoming fast friends. Kang Kang and Kunkin have also bonded. One time, Kang Kang even landed on Kunkin's head, and Kunkin didn't seem to mind at all. It was a picture-perfect moment of harmony. Today, I decided it was time to remove the splint from Kunkin's leg. I've been watching him, and it's clear his right hind leg has healed. It's amazing how quickly animals recover. If it were a human, a fracture would take at least 100 days to heal. The saying, "It takes 100 days to heal bones and tendons," really isn't an exaggeration. Once I removed the bandages and the splint, Kunkin immediately seemed more comfortable. He cautiously took a few steps, and upon realizing his leg had healed, he began running joyfully. His gait was still a little bouncy, and I worried about lingering effects. But considering how resilient animals are, I figured he'd be fine. Even if there were some after effects, I could keep feeding him. He wouldn't go hungry from being unable to hunt. To release his wild nature, I decided to take him outside for a walk. I tied a rope around him and led him out. After being cooped up in the cabin for a week, Kunkin seemed to have forgotten what a beautiful world lay outside. He stood there, dazed, for a moment, then tried to break free and run. We made it to the beach, and Kunkin eagerly stepped onto the fine sand, curiously feeling the different texture under his paws. After a few moments of adjusting, he began darting around the beach, full of energy. I led him to the water's edge, where he cautiously observed the waves from a distance. After a while, his confidence grew, and he started splashing at the water with his paws. Realizing the waves posed no threat, he began chasing after them, having the time of his life. I took the opportunity to give him a bath. His fur had begun to carry a mix of salted fish and a fishy odor, probably from Big Bear's snacks rubbing off on him. After the bath, Kunkin returned to playing in the sea until noon. By the time we got back to the camp, he was soaked, so we laid down in the grass to dry off under the sun. I gave him some dried banana leaves, and Kunkin happily crunched away, his teeth growing ever stronger. Today, Big Bear didn't bring any fresh fish, so I had to settle for cooking some salted fish for Kunkin. To my surprise, unlike his mother, Kunkin didn't seem to care for salted fish. After sniffing it, he wrinkled his nose in disgust. With no other options, I cooked some dried snake meat, which he grudgingly ate. It's so odd, your mother loves salted fish, yet you turn your nose up at it. Did you have a bad experience with it as a cub? As I looked over my dwindling food supply, I began to feel concerned. Kunkin eats so much, and I'll need to figure out new sources of food. Otherwise, with this growing family, I'm not sure how we're going to survive. Chapter 44, The Mangrove Forest. December 31st, I rose early this morning to go fishing. Kunkin isn't fond of dried salted fish, so I've taken to catching fresh fish just for him. I still haven't found a freshwater lake yet. If I could, the fish there would keep Kunkin fed until he grows up. My fishing skills have become quite sharp. By observing the tides, the weather, and the movement of the waves, I can tell exactly when the fish will bite. If there were a fishing competition, I'd surely take home the title of fishing master. It didn't take long before I reeled in 2 fish, each around 4 or 5 pounds, enough to keep Kunkin satisfied for the day. Since Kunkin refuses to eat raw fish, I've found myself cooking for him every morning. Funny, I used to never light a fire just for breakfast, but with Kunkin around, it's become part of my routine. After cooking a pot of fish soup, Kunkin woke up right on cue, drawn in by the smell, and dove straight into his meal. His internal clock seems entirely linked to when I cook his food. Once breakfast was done, I thought about what to do today. The weather was perfect, sunny with a gentle breeze. My eyes drifted over to the bamboo raft resting on the grassy field, and suddenly, an idea struck: why not take Kunkin out for a ride on the sea? An hour later, Kunkin and I were gliding across the water, seated on the bamboo raft. At first, Kunkin was ecstatic, darting to the edge of the raft and pawing at the waves. But before long, he tumbled into the water with a splash. He floated there, panicked, flailing his paws as he swam back toward me. I sighed and hoisted him back onto the raft. Soaked and humbled, he settled quietly beside me, casting wary glances around. I paddled along the southern shore of the island. Before long, we reached the mouth of a wide inlet I'd been eyeing on a previous outing. This time, I decided to venture in. Adjusting the oars, I steered us deeper into the inlet. After about an hour, the water began to shallow, and the darkened shore stretched before us. I kept paddling for another half hour, the landscape slowly shifting into something unfamiliar. It felt like a marshland, the muddy banks resembling dried-up riverbeds, divided by narrow channels. The waves had quieted, and as the tide pulled away, tangled roots of the shoreline trees began to show. These trees looked different from the ones I'd seen elsewhere. Their roots were sprawling, their trunks twisted, and their leaves glistened like wax. Some of the smaller trees barely came up to my waist, while the larger ones towered above, stretching toward the sky. As we entered this strange place, the air became heavy with a mix of scents: earthy mud, salty sea, the fragrance of plants, and a faint hint of seafood. It hit me suddenly: this must be a mangrove forest. Mangrove forests thrive in tropical and subtropical coastal regions, with mangrove trees dominating the landscape. These trees are essential for filtering seawater, preventing erosion, and storing carbon. Often called the guardians of the coast and the lungs of the ocean, they are also a haven for fish, shrimp, crabs, and shellfish. My mind immediately went to giant mud crabs, those enormous sea crabs I'd seen foreign vloggers catch in their videos. The thought made my mouth water. I stopped paddling and stood up, scanning the muddy ground for signs of crabs. Strangely, the sand revealed no trace of them. I pushed the raft to the shore and cautiously stepped onto the mud, half expecting to sink. Thankfully, the mud only came up to my shoes. I had tied Kunkin to the raft, and he tugged at the rope, barking impatiently. I let him be, figuring it was safer for him to stay put. I carefully scoured the mud for any sign of crabs. After just a few steps, I spotted a faint outline. There, buried in the mud, lay a crab. It blended so perfectly with its surroundings that it was nearly invisible until I got close. This mud crab was massive. As I neared, it raised its claws in a menacing display. There was no way I was grabbing it with my hands. I found a stick, sharpened the end, and jabbed it hard into the crab's back. With a satisfying crack, I skewered it, its 8 legs thrashing wildly. This one weighed at least 2 pounds. I checked. It was a male, easily distinguishable by the shape of its abdomen flap. Kunkin, seeing me land the crab, broke free from the rope and charged over, only to trip and face plant into the mud. I couldn't help but laugh as I wiped the dirt off his snout. We spent the next few hours combing through the mangrove forest, which turned out to be teeming with crabs. I went after the biggest ones, and by the time the tide started to rise, I had caught 8 huge mud crabs. The largest must have weighed 3 to 4 pounds, its claws spread wider than my face. Just as I was scanning the mud for more, Kunkin suddenly let out a sharp yelp. I turned to see a small crab latched onto his paw. Tears welled up in his eyes from the pain, and I hurried over to pry the claws off. Fortunately, the crab was small, and Kunkin's paws were thick enough that he wasn't hurt. Kunkin, now confident again, tried to pounce on the crabs, but hesitated at the last second. I retied him to the raft and, with 8 crabs in tow, we headed back. Before leaving, I took note of all the other creatures in the mangroves: hermit crabs, algae, shellfish, even rats, ants, and snakes. Once back at camp, Kunkin and I cleaned ourselves up. I prepared 4 of the crabs, 2 steamed, 2 grilled. The translucent crab meat was tender, and the golden roe was as tempting as it gets. One bite, and the flavor exploded, juicy and rich. Even Kunkin was drooling uncontrollably. Today, I stumbled upon a hidden gold mine. What a rewarding day. I should explore more often. Who knows what other delicious surprises are waiting out there. Chapter 45, The New Year's Day. January 1, 2016. Today marks New Year's Day, celebrated around the world, yet I find myself alone on this deserted island. Time seems to fly, and I've now spent 6 months here. This morning, I counted the marks on the stick I used to track the days. It clearly displayed 191 days. In these 191 days, I've experienced profound changes in my life. Once an ordinary young man, I was unexpectedly cast away to this island, forced to battle adversity and struggle to survive day by day. Although I consider myself fortunate compared to others, I mourn the loss of my 3 companions, who tragically perished. Captain Wang and First Mate Lu vanished into the vast sea, and I can only wonder if their bodies still float beneath the waves. Old Gao also did not survive. He left us the day before we landed. During festivals, thoughts of loved ones grow stronger. At this moment, my heart aches with longing for my family, friends, and hometown. In the morning, Kunken lay lazily asleep. I opened the door and stepped outside, standing by the ocean for nearly half an hour, lost in memories. Eventually, I decided to visit Gao Deming. Carrying a jar of fresh water, I slowly made my way to his grave. The small mound had been worn down by the rain and was overgrown with weeds. Since burying Gao, I hadn't dared to visit him, as each time I saw that mound, my heart felt incredibly heavy, and tears flowed uncontrollably. The images of the disaster at sea replayed in my mind. 3 vibrant lives vanished before my eyes, and I was powerless to intervene, struggling merely to survive. I poured the fresh water at Gao's grave as an offering. Lacking yellow paper, candles, or incense, this jar of water was my only means of expressing sorrow. I carefully cleared the weeds from the grave, repiled the dirt, and surrounded it with stones to ensure its stability. Gao's last words echoed in my mind, to take his news back home and urge his family to live on bravely. I've never dared to forget his request. Standing before the grave, past scenes played out like a movie in my mind. I bowed my head in silence, and the weight of desolation surged within me, ultimately erupting uncontrollably. I slumped to the ground, crying out loud, curling up and hugging my knees, burying my head in them, sobbing uncontrollably. Captain Wang, First Mate Lu, Gao Deming, I miss you. And my family and friends, do you know I'm still alive? At this moment, are you all also remembering me, at my grave? Why hasn't a single ship passed by this cursed island for so long? When will I be able to return home? The louder I cried, the more uncontrollable my emotions became, tears and snot flowing freely. Just then, I felt something furry nudging beside me. Surprised, I looked up to find Kunken, gently nudging my back with its furry head, its comical expression breaking my resolve. I cried and laughed simultaneously, my face wet with tears. Ignoring my disgust, I hugged Kunken tightly and, still sobbing, said, "How did you find me, little guy? Are you here to mock me? Or are you hungry again and come to beg for food?" Kunken remained quietly in my arms, not struggling, as if it understood my emotions. I don't know how long I held it, venting my feelings until my mood began to calm. Looking down, I saw Kunken's face damp with my tears, and it occasionally licked them off. I laughed again. This little one was like a little angel in my life, saving my lonely and restless heart at a critical moment. As my emotions gradually settled, I owed it all to Kunken. Despite its usual clumsiness, it always managed to bring me joy and even the motivation to keep going during critical moments. When I think back to those days after escaping the island, I remember Kunken's playful antics. Without Kunken's company, I might have fallen into depression from loneliness or even taken a darker path. After saying goodbye to Gao, I returned to camp with Kunken in my arms. Upon entering the hut, I discovered that the door latch had been opened by Kunken. It had managed to find me by following my scent. I was both amazed by its cleverness and worried. What if it couldn't find me, got lost, or encountered other dangers? So, I reinforced the latch and raised its height. On New Year's Eve, I built a large bonfire and let Kunken, Little Yu, and Kong Kong out. After a long period of domestication, they no longer had the urge to escape. They surrounded me, eating the food I had gathered during the day. Kunken even curiously reached out to touch the bonfire, accidentally singeing its paw in the flames and yelping in pain. I laughed so hard I almost fell over. Curiosity really can get you into trouble. That night, I stayed up late, playing with my little friends around the bonfire until midnight. They finally fell asleep beside the fire, and I carried them back inside to settle them down. With countless thoughts swirling in my mind, I slowly drifted off to sleep. Chapter 46, Potatoes. January 2nd, I woke up today to find it was already noon. Kunkin had awakened me in his own special way. This little guy has figured out how to climb onto my bed, probably hungry and realizing the cook was still lazily snoozing. He decided to give my face a thorough licking as a wake-up call. Feeling helpless, I hurriedly got out of bed and started a fire to prepare a meal. After breakfast, I planned to continue my road construction project. Kunkin's leg has healed, but I wasn't comfortable leaving him alone in the house, especially since he managed to escape yesterday. So, I decided to take him along and tie him to a tree while I worked. So far, I had completed 2 paths, and today's task was to connect them. However, with Kunkin by my side, my work efficiency dropped significantly. I had to keep a watchful eye on him as I worked. Nevertheless, this little guy did help alleviate some of my fatigue. January 10th, the new path turned out to be relatively long, and with Kunkin accompanying me, it took 8 days to clear the trees. While I was clearing the ground, I accidentally dug up 2 potatoes with my shovel. What a delightful surprise, a casual remark leads to unexpected fortune. I never expected to uncover such treasures while working on the road. I continued digging carefully and eventually found 6 potatoes, each about the size of a clenched fist. Examining the leaves and flowers of the potatoes, I recognized them instantly, round green leaves and white 5-petaled flowers. It dawned on me that I had previously overlooked these natural gifts. I started searching the surrounding area more closely and ended up harvesting 5 potato plants, yielding a total of 35 potatoes of various sizes. This discovery thrilled me, prompting me to temporarily set aside my road construction plans to explore the forest with Kunkin, hoping to find more potatoes. Unfortunately, aside from the small area where I found the first ones, I didn't find anything else. These wild potatoes were not only small, but each plant yielded only up to 6 potatoes, a stark contrast to the larger varieties cultivated back home. Still, this did not diminish their value to me. I decided not to eat any of the 35 potatoes, instead, I planned to use them all as seed. Potatoes are resilient plants that can withstand cold and drought. Back in my northern hometown, we can harvest them twice a year. Here, in this warm and humid tropical climate, they should thrive even better. The first step was to encourage sprouting. To facilitate this, I dug a hole about 25 centimeters deep in a sunny outdoor spot, layered it with fine sand, and cut the potatoes into small pieces, placing them on top of the sand. After laying down each layer of potato pieces, I added another layer of sand and finally sprinkled some fruit on top, covering everything with dry grass for insulation. Although the island's temperature isn't as cold as back home, I still added a thicker layer of topsoil for safety, burying it about 5 to 6 centimeters deep. Now, all I had to do was wait patiently. Back home, sprouting usually takes about 20 to 25 days, but I believe the island's climate would shorten that time. Each potato can produce many sprouts, but to ensure their survival, it's best to select only 4 to 6 larger sprouts. Therefore, these 35 potatoes could potentially provide me with 140 to 210 sprouts, conservatively estimating about 175 sprouts. If each sprout yields 5 potatoes, I could harvest 875 potatoes. If Kunkin and I eat 10 a day, that should last us quite a while. However, it's unwise to celebrate too early, as all of this is still just speculation. Before the sprouts emerge, I needed to quickly clear a suitable plot of land for planting these potato seedlings. The soil on the island is fertile, but potatoes prefer a dry and sunny environment. I decided to clear a field about 2 kilometers north of the cabin, in a grassy area near the mountains where the elevation is higher, making it suitable for planting. I dug drainage ditches to prevent flooding when the rainy season arrives. With my shovel and machete in hand, I took Kunkin along and marked out a plot of land about half an acre, approximately 300 square meters. Although I wouldn't need such a large area for my initial planting of under 200 seedlings, I planned to expand the planting area for the second batch. I wanted to prepare ahead to avoid future complications. Weeding and turning the soil took me over a day. I also added many dried leaves, seafood shells, animal dung, and even my own contributions. Then, I spent another 2 days digging drainage and irrigation channels, dividing the land into 7 long rows, with a 30-centimeter deep irrigation ditch between each row and stone walls on both sides of the planting area. Finally, I felt like something was missing and suddenly thought, what's a field without a scarecrow? Though there aren't many birds here, it's essential to have that sense of ritual. I found 2 bamboo sticks, one vertical and one horizontal, bound at 1/3 of the way up, and then I put my artistic talent to use by tying on some weeds. After an hour of effort, a rather ugly scarecrow was born. I couldn't help but cringe at the craftsmanship of the scarecrow, but it served its purpose. Kunkin barked at it incessantly, as if saying, what a hideous creature. Not to mention the birds. I spent another half-hour crafting a straw hat for the scarecrow. Though it wasn't very elaborate, it at least looked somewhat appropriate. After all this, I looked at the field yet to be planted and felt a great sense of accomplishment, nodding with satisfaction. Now, all that was left was to wait for the potatoes to sprout. Chapter 47, Island Diary 7. January 3rd. I finished the last of my honey, so I decided to check on the beehives. The honeycomb was still a little undercooked, and I worried that frequently harvesting honey might disturb the bee colony or even drive them away. To address this, I spent the entire day constructing 2 new beehives, carefully calculating their distances before placing them in the backyard. I'm preparing to raise 2 more colonies of bees. January 2nd. While taking Kunkin for a walk in the woods, I discovered 2 bee nests. However, their locations were precarious, so I decided not to risk climbing to retrieve them. January 3rd. Today, I took Kunkin up a mountain, hoping to find new bee nests along the way, but luck was not on my side. Instead, I gathered a generous amount of bananas and grapes. The banana chips and raisins I dried last time are nearly gone, and both Xiaoyu and Kangkang love these treats, so I plan to dry more this time. January 4th. I followed the path through the backyard to the sugarcane grove and harvested 2 fresh stalks of sugarcane. I still have half a jar of brown sugar left from my last batch, so I'm not in a hurry to collect more sugarcane. After all, wild sugarcane is quite heavy, and the roads here are still rough, so I didn't want to carry too much. However, I did collect several lemons, which I sliced and laid out to dry. Now, in front of my wooden cabin, the fenced yard is filled with drying banana and lemon slices, while grapes hang around the house to air dry. Kunkin occasionally sneaks a few bunches, making it difficult to keep an eye on him. He really takes after his mother, always stealing salty fish. Lately, bear visits have decreased, perhaps it has grown tired of the salty fish. It used to come every day, but now it only shows up once or twice a week, which leaves me a bit disappointed. Is the fish I'm drying not tasty enough? My camp is gradually taking on a human touch. From a distance, it resembles the secluded life depicted in books and movies. A wooden cabin, a fence, food, and a dog. Well, now it's Kunkin, even a bear. While there may not be heavy snow blocking the mountains, there are blue skies, white clouds, sandy beaches, and rolling waves. Despite being forced into this lifestyle, it carries a certain romantic charm. January 5th. Today, I finally found a new beehive hidden in a crevice of a cliff. Fortunately, the hive was built relatively low, so I was able to carry it back in a woven bag. Now, the beehive in the backyard has welcomed its second colony of bees. However, I paid the price with swollen foreheads and cheeks from bee stings that lasted 2 days, and Kunkin also got stung on the nose, leaving a big red bump. Another piece of good news today. The potato pieces buried in the sand have begun to sprout. I was thrilled and carefully watered them. Once the sprouts grow a bit more, I can transplant them. January 6th. While looking for bee nests in the woods with Kunkin, I passed by the small stream where I previously planted rice. Now, this stream has become quite narrow, with only a finger width of water flowing. I accidentally glanced at the rice field and found that 3 of the 5 sprouted rice plants were still standing tall. These 3 rice plants had matured, their heads drooping as if they were humble achievers, mocking me, the loser. Look, we're thriving without your care. I quickly checked on them, and the ears of rice on these 3 plants were filled with plump grains. The water in the field had long dried up, but the soil was still a bit moist. I truly didn't expect them to thrive under such conditions. Had I known, I would have moved them closer to the stream with more water, perhaps all 5 would have survived. Each of these 3 rice plants bore 1 or 200 grains of rice, and losing the other 2 meant missing out on 3 to 400 fresh, plump seeds. Although I felt some regret, it was pointless to dwell on it now. I carefully uprooted the rice plants, wrapped them in leaves, and brought them back to camp. Back at camp, I found some stones and carefully threshed the rice grains, collecting them into a pottery jar. The rice I harvested this time was much better than the yellowed grains from the last attempt. Using these as seeds should yield a higher germination rate. I didn't count the grains, but I estimated that if these seeds are successfully cultivated, they will provide me with rice for quite some time. This time, I must be more cautious, patiently wait for the rainy season, and choose the right planting location. Last time, I carelessly picked a small stream to plant without much thought, which led to failure. Now that I understand there are dry and rainy seasons on the island, I must select a spot close to a water source to ensure ample moisture. Though the rainy season may not arrive until March or April, I am willing to wait patiently. My life is becoming increasingly hopeful. These 2 miraculous items, potatoes and rice, have given me great confidence. All of this positive change seems to have begun since Kunkin appeared. I consider him my lucky star and mascot, picking a red flower and placing it on his head, making Kunkin look even cuter. By the way, Kunkin is a little male bear. When he needs to relieve himself, he lifts his leg against trees and rocks like a little dog, as if he can't fire without a target. Fortunately, he has good hygiene awareness and rarely makes a mess inside the house. The only exception was one night when I didn't wake up to let him out. He ended up leaving a pile at the door, almost causing me to slip on it the next morning. Chapter 48, Iron Ore. January 10th. I checked the potato pieces in the germination field, and most of them had sprouted tender shoots. I could finally transplant these seedlings. Carefully, I removed the sprouted potatoes, anxious not to break the delicate shoots, and stacked them together, washing off the surface soil. Next, I dug small holes in the cultivated farmland, each about the size of a fist. I buried the sprouted potatoes, leaving only part of the tender shoot exposed. Out of 35 potatoes, I managed to sprout 183 shoots, which was roughly what I expected. The remaining pieces had either rotted or shriveled beyond recognition, losing their value. I could only scatter them on the ground to serve as fertilizer. Due to my gentle and careful movements, it took me an entire day to plant these potato seedlings. January 13th. For the past 3 days, I have been building a fence to enclose the farmland where I planted the potatoes. January 15th. I began preparing for rice planting. Although the rainy season hadn't arrived yet, I decided to clear a piece of paddy field in advance for cultivating rice. This time, I wanted to find a stream that was wide and had a strong flow, avoiding the mistake from last time when the stream dried up in the dry season, causing my rice seedlings to wither. Soon, I found a fast-flowing stream with lush trees on both sides. I selected a piece of land and spent 10 days clearing away the trees and vegetation. Then, just like last time, I dug ditches to channel water into the fields. I also cut a piece of wood to use as a sluice gate to control the water flow. January 15th. Today, I took Kunkin with me to climb a mountain, planning to gather more sulfur. I currently use sulfur as an insect repellent, and it works very well. While mining sulfur, I discovered some mineral-rich stones beneath the hard soil at the mountain top. These stones were shining brightly. I was sure it was some kind of metal, but it wasn't gold because the color was wrong. After a volcanic eruption, magma can bring out rare metals like iron, cobalt, nickel, and copper. Although I wasn't certain which metal it was, I picked a few pieces to put in my backpack, planning to try refining them back at the camp. January 17th. I crushed the ore I brought back from the mountain into small pieces and continued grinding it into sand, with the shiny material becoming more apparent, resembling crushed silver. I used a simple sieve to separate the metal particles, allowing the sand to blow away with the wind, leaving only a small handful of metal particles. I found a pottery bowl, placed these metal particles inside, and put it into the earth kiln, firing it for the entire morning. My arms were sore from working the bellows. After it cooled down, I took out the pottery bowl and found a piece of coal-like metal with many holes in it, its surface blackened. I tapped this piece of metal against a stone, producing a crisp sound. It was hard, but it shattered easily under pressure. The firing wasn't sufficient, the metal wasn't pure enough. I smashed this lump of burned metal into smaller pieces with a large stone to remove impurities, then fired it again. To increase the temperature, I packed the kiln with charcoal and sticks, sealing the opening with yellow clay, leaving only a small hole for ventilation and adding charcoal. Then, I frantically worked the bellows, alternating between my arms. When one got sore, I switched to the other. The wind blowing into the kiln made the flames roar, shooting up to the top of the kiln, and the color of the flames turned pale blue. By nightfall, the kiln walls began to crack, with a deep fissure revealing glowing charcoal within. The earth kiln announced its retirement. There was nothing I could do. The temperature couldn't be maintained. I kicked the earth kiln open, and the flying sparks burned holes in my pants. What a waste. I could have just poked it with a stick, I thought, but I had no time to dwell on that. I found the pottery bowl inside the kiln, glowing red hot, shining like a treasure in the night, but I was too focused on the metal inside to appreciate it. The temperature in the kiln had risen so high that the metal seemed to have melted. I regretted not making a clay mold in advance to pour the molten metal into to create tools. Now it was too late, and once it cooled, it would solidify. I decided to test the hardness of this metal. I found a bamboo tube, used a stick to hold the pottery bowl, and poured the liquid metal into the bamboo tube. As soon as the bamboo tube touched the liquid metal, it began to burn. Luckily, the bamboo tube was newly made and still moist, otherwise, it would have exploded, spilling the metal everywhere. When doing things for the first time, mistakes are inevitable, just like when I first planted rice. I didn't think too much. I immediately took the stick holding the bamboo tube and ran to the water tank, throwing the bamboo tube into the water. Sizzle, splash, a sound, and white steam rose up, with the water tank gradually calming down. After fishing out the bamboo tube, I found it had split open, but the metal at the bottom had solidified. I poured the metal out, holding it in my palm for observation. After solidifying, it formed a round disc, about the size of two yuan-2 coins stacked together, still slightly warm to the touch. I tried to scratch the metal against a stone. It was pretty hard, but it fell far short of my machete and axe. Applying a little pressure caused some white powder to flake off. I struck it a few times with a small stone. It slightly deformed, but overall, the hardness was still quite decent. This definitely wasn't iron because the melting point of iron is around 1500 degrees Celsius, and my earth kiln couldn't reach that temperature. It also wasn't silver, tin, or copper, as it was harder than those metals. Although I had some knowledge of metals, I couldn't identify what this particular metal was. I decided not to dwell on it. Refining metals is both time-consuming and labor-intensive, and my current tools are sufficient. I'll explore the small island further in the future and study these high-tech materials later. Chapter 49, The Days of Road Construction. January 28th. Recently, I've been busy building roads in the forest with Kunkin. If there were a drone overhead, everyone would see me creating a grid pattern through the trees. So far, I've completed 7 roads, which means I've likely unlocked 1/5 of the forest. During the road construction, I stumbled upon many pleasant surprises, including various spices, wild ginger, Sichuan pepper, star anise, and goji berries, along with some wild plants like radishes, wild pineapples, gourd leaves, roadside greens, chives, and amaranth, also known as wild cabbage, although it looks quite different from regular cabbage. I also discovered 2 more chestnut trees, and Kunkin and I enjoyed roasted chestnuts for several days. In addition, there were many unknown plants that appeared to be edible, but I didn't recognize them and hesitated to try, as they might be toxic. Some of these plants didn't seem completely wild. I speculated that seeds might have been inadvertently dropped by birds from the island, which serendipitously took root in the ground, allowing me to reap the benefits. I carefully protected these plants, making sure to avoid them while clearing the paths and only harvesting the ripe fruits. I refrained from transplanting them because I felt I didn't yet understand the island's seasonal changes well enough. Any unusual weather could impact their survival rates. Over the past few days, we've had occasional light rains on the island, signaling that the rainy season is approaching. The potatoes I planted are thriving, with 90% of the seedlings already grown and producing new leaves. They now stand at over a foot tall and look vibrant. By the way, during my road construction, the last beehive finally produced a colony of bees, and I harvested honey from the first hive. The bees are working faster than ever, and this time I collected a small jar of honey. Kunkin enjoyed it so much that his mouth was covered in it, and he didn't seem to mind the sweetness. Instead, he chewed away happily. I worried that the little guy might get cavities. Kunkin is growing rapidly now. He's about 60 to 70 centimeters long and has learned to stand. At first, he was quite wobbly and unstable. Sometimes, I would hold his paws and gently sway him side to side, making it look like he was dancing, which was quite amusing. His voice has also become a bit rougher, and when he gets excited, he lets out a loud howl. That's quite intimidating. It startled me awake from my afternoon nap, leading me to give him a light smack. Xiaoyu remains the same, though he has gained quite a bit of weight. His three-part mouth and little nose keep twitching. Several times, I suspected he was chewing something, but when I opened his jaw, all I found were his two big rabbit teeth. I couldn't figure out what exactly was causing his mouth to quiver. Perhaps it was just itchy. Kang Kang has learned a few more words, including Kang Kang, Kunkin, and Xiaoyu. Whenever he finishes saying the Erhua tone, he adds an EY, perhaps because he hasn't quite mastered it yet. He has also learned to call my name, Zhang Lin. One morning, I was in a groggy state when I suddenly heard someone calling me. It startled me, and when I sat up, I realized it was Kang Kang. Our best interaction is when I say, "Good morning," and he replies with, "Good morning," which gives me a sense of accomplishment and has developed into a daily morning greeting habit. I've grown a bit tired of staying in the forest. The tropical rainforest is humid and stifling during both the rainy and dry seasons, feeling like a sealed steam chamber, which makes even a day's stay quite exhausting. Mosquitoes, snakes, insects, and ants are abundant. And each time I enter the woods, I apply some sulfur powder on myself. It works well, but I still get bitten by mosquitoes or ants crawling into my clothes, which is quite uncomfortable. Therefore, I've decided to temporarily halt road construction in the forest and turn my attention to the mountains. While the rocky areas are relatively easier to climb, some parts are quite steep and require detours. There are also gnarled trees blocking the way, making it much harder to navigate than the mountain paths of human society. I plan to improve this mountain path by cutting down obstructing trees, clearing away tripping vines and branches, digging small steps in steep areas with a shovel, and filling in the depressions with rocks and soil. It currently takes me nearly 3 days to climb this mountain, but I estimate that once the road is repaired, I could reach the top with a light load in just 1 day, or possibly even less. February 6th. After 11 days of hard work, I finally completed the mountain road. On the day I finished the road, I climbed the mountain. I set out in the morning and reached the top before sunset, greatly improving my efficiency. The saying of my ancestors, "To get rich, first build roads," proved true. Now, I can easily go up the mountain to gather bananas, pick grapes, and collect water, making things much more convenient and ensuring greater safety. During the road construction, I encountered a goat for the first time up close. It was a large goat accompanied by 2 kids. The adult goat was larger than the sheep we usually see, with a slender body, slender limbs filled with muscle, and astonishing jumping ability. It had long, slightly curved horns with sharp tips, which seemed sturdy and could easily penetrate a human body with force. Wild animals are not to be trifled with. Despite being a herd of grazing goats, their intelligence is astonishing. When I spotted the 3 goats, the adult one had already noticed me and was warily observing my every move, while the 2 kids kept their heads down, grazing. As I slowly drew my bow from my back and prepared to shoot, Kunkin, in his clumsy excitement, suddenly let out a loud growl at the goats, causing them to bolt and vanish from my sight, leaving me standing in the wind, bewildered. After scaring off the goats, Kunkin stood on his hind legs, as if to take credit for it, shaking at me in triumph. Frustrated, I gave him a light smack, though it wasn't hard, just a gentle reprimand. Now that the little guy has toughened up, even a firm slap wouldn't necessarily hurt him. However, he immediately slumped down, sitting on the ground, looking quite dejected. I had no choice but to pick up his fluffy bear-like head and patiently comfort him until he perked up again. During this time, I also encountered 3 wild boars. Although they were not very large, their sharp tusks gleamed menacingly. I quickly grabbed Kunkin and stood alert, fearing he might not understand the danger and provoke them. After all, wild boars do not tolerate provocation. If they go wild, both Kunkin and I, being inexperienced, could end up in serious trouble. Fortunately, the 3 wild boars showed no interest in us. After grazing for a while nearby, they left without incident. Chapter 50, Triangular Wooden House. February 10th. With the mountain path I built, I have now completed a total of 10 roads crisscrossing a vast area of rainforest. However, roads alone are not enough. I still lack a safe shelter. Therefore, I plan to construct a small wooden house at the intersections of these roads, providing a secure place for rest and overnight stays. I decide to start building from the nearest intersection. First, I clear a patch of land and gather materials, cutting down several thin wooden sticks. Since this wooden house is meant for occasional use and not for long-term habitation, I don't need to make it too large or luxurious. Given the humid air and wet ground in the forest, the house must be elevated. I use 4 thicker wooden posts to create the foundation, then add crossbeams in a shape half a meter off the ground, securing them with vines. Next, I lay thinner sticks horizontally on the frame to form the floor of the house. For the walls and roof, I choose the simplest design, a single unit. I place longer wooden beams on either side of the frame, forming an A shape when viewed from the side. I then block the gaps on both sides and fill the spaces between the wooden beams with mud. Thus, a simple, A-shaped wooden house is completed. The space inside is small, just enough for me and Kunkin. However, due to its elevated structure, I don't need to install a bed. I can sleep directly on the wooden floor. Because of the simple structure and my somewhat careless construction, I managed to complete the A-frame house in less than a day. Over the next 6 days, I build similarly structured houses at each intersection, adorning them with vines and leaves. Now, these small houses blend in well with the surrounding vegetation. February 17th. The spring wind in February cuts like scissors. Although the seasonal changes on the island are not very noticeable, I have recently felt strong sea breezes and continuous light rain for 3 days, indicating that the rainy season is approaching. Therefore, I prepare to reinforce the roofs of the wooden houses before the rain arrives. Currently, my roof structure consists of wood, with 2 layers of cut bamboo laid on top. This structure provides only mediocre rain protection. The bamboo has shrunk significantly due to the drought and sun exposure, and there is already a leak in the northeast corner of the house. After some thought, I decide to switch to a tiled roof. I now have enough time to make tiles using yellow clay. After extensive testing, the pottery I made has proven successful. It hasn't shown any signs of softness or cracking over the past 6 months, except for one pot that I accidentally dropped and broke. Before I can proceed, I need to build a new earth kiln, as the previous one broke during iron smelting. This time, I plan to make a larger, sturdier kiln. I construct a circular kiln about 2 meters in diameter right at the door of my house. First, I build a circle with some flat stones, then coat it with yellow clay, building it up to about 1 meter high with alternating layers of stones and clay, finishing with a thick layer of clay on the surface. The internal structure remains the same as before, separated into 2 layers 40 centimeters off the ground, with openings for the flames to escape. This kiln is large, with 3 openings for adding firewood, and thus a massive kiln is completed. Such a large kiln requires a few days to air dry, giving me time to make the tile molds. To produce a batch of qualified tiles, I must ensure uniformity in size, shape, and dimensions, which requires molds. Without suitable molds, I have to create my own. I cut 4 wooden boards and assemble them into a rectangle measuring about 40 centimeters by 30 centimeters. With the molds ready, the manufacturing process becomes simple. I evenly knead the yellow clay into the bottom of the mold and press it down with a small wooden board. Before this, I sprinkle a layer of dry yellow clay underneath to prevent sticking. After forming, I remove the rectangular clay piece and use a bamboo tube to create a curve at one end, allowing the tiles to hang and stack properly, enabling rainwater to flow down efficiently and greatly improving their rainproof capabilities. These tiles are larger than usual, so I worry that they might be too heavy when hung on the roof, potentially breaking the beams. Therefore, I make them quite thin, about 1 centimeter in thickness. My wooden house has a total area of 50 square meters. You might think this is quite small compared to your own home, but in the wild, such a spacious shelter can be considered a luxury. This space is 3 to 4 times the size of your room. Making the clay for these tiles took 2 days, and I am sure many will break or be flawed during the firing process, so I made a large quantity. February 21st. After 3 days of drying, the earth kiln is almost ready. I neatly arrange the tile molds inside, with this large kiln capable of firing only 1/3 of the tiles at a time. You can imagine how many clay pieces I have made. Before I light the fire, I suddenly realize that the previous blower I used seems far too small compared to the new kiln, like a toothpick stirring a large pot. I quickly build a larger blower. Its structure is simple, taking me only half a day. After connecting the blower to the kiln, I begin the firing process. I won't go into detail about this process, but 3 days later, I have a large number of tiles. Of the clay pieces I made, less than 2/3 are fired well, the rest either broke, cracked, or deformed, affecting their usability. I start stacking the tiles, beginning from the highest point and layering them one by one. Each side is topped with 6 layers of tiles, making my small wooden house look even more beautiful. What once resembled a caveman's dwelling, has now transformed into a structure reminiscent of the Han Dynasty. In short, it looks much more grand than before.